prospect of dangerous climate change by mid-century is something we hear about frequently in the news. As important as concrete policy questions are about what should be done, we face companion questions of justice. In particular, I have in mind questions about fairness in the distribution of benefits and burdens. We may hear much from politicians and pundits about win-win-win solutions. They tell us how we can protect the environment, how businesses can profit from participation in the green economy, and how we can live prosperous lives without real sacrifice. As it turns out, things are not that simple. Some of the poorest, most vulnerable people in the world will be affected first and worst. Some geographic regions may even benefit somewhat over the next 100 years, at least in narrowly defined economic terms. The policy options most likely to make the most difference mostly involve substantial changes in behavior by the world's most affluent people and nations. On reflection, the reason for the focus on the well-off should become obvious. It's the global affluent whose carbon footprint is by far the greatest. Contrast that with the fact that much of the world, as much as 25% by some estimates, lives under conditions of energy poverty. That is to say, they lack reliable sources of energy sufficient to secure clean water and adequate sanitation services, run schools and hospitals, and develop the industrial capacity needed to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Contrary to popular political rhetoric, we are not all in this together. In short, we face unprecedented questions of global justice because much of the heaviest environmental burdens of unabated climate change will fall disproportionately upon the global poor, if not enough is done soon enough. If the environmental burdens on the global poor are to be lessened, consistent with widely shared goals of poverty reduction, then the heaviest economic burdens must fall upon the global affluent. In this segment, I'll talk about how scientists set the threshold of dangerous, perhaps irreversible changes in the Earth's atmosphere, and some of the consequences we should expect by mid-century, with a focus on the impact on nations I describe under the rubric of those affected first and worst. Since 2009, international climate treaty negotiators have proceeded with a target level of atmospheric greenhouse gas concentration of 450 parts per million maximum at mid-century. That figure is thought to correlate with a 2-degree Celsius rise in temperature over pre-industrial levels. At 450 parts per million, some of what we can expect in the way of dangerous climate change includes rising sea levels, leaving large parts of many of the world's low-lying port cities below water, the flooding of many small island nations, perhaps displacement of millions of persons, species extinction, rapidly accelerated thawing of the world's largest glaciers, upon which a large percentage of the world relies primarily for its freshwater needs. For perspective, we're now at around 400 parts per million, and we have until roughly 2050 to stabilize emissions at the 450 part per million level. There are many other well-known projected adverse effects as well, and among the most significant are those pertaining to water and agriculture. For example, extended periods and severity of drought, accelerated desertification, expansion and worsening of the geographic zones at the highest risk for infectious diseases and pests that destroy crops, disruption of the hydrologic cycle, permanently reducing available groundwater, more frequent and extreme weather events and disrupted growing seasons, crop loss from flooding and freshwater runoff. All of these problems will be especially significant where agriculture is dependent upon rainfall rather than irrigation, because they are likely to be felt most dramatically by nations that are among the poorest, hottest, agriculturally most vulnerable to weather pattern disruption, economically most dependent upon its agricultural sector, most vulnerable to vector-borne tropical diseases, and least able to adapt to changed conditions due to disadvantaging geography and lack of economic resources. The countries affected first and worst are mostly within the equatorial regions of Africa and Southeast Asia. Moreover, the hardest hit will be the less economically developed countries that have contributed least to the problem. Significantly, there is nothing that any of these countries alone can do to prevent these outcomes. They face existential threats that only timely and substantial collective action by the developed nations and other large greenhouse gas emitters can address effectively.